In the summer of 1914, Europe went to war expecting a repeat of 1870. Rapid advances in the open, cavalry exploiting breakthroughs, a campaign over by Christmas. For a few weeks, it seemed to unfold exactly that way. German armies crossed Belgium into France and reached within 20 to 25 miles of Paris. The French counterattacked on the Marne. The British shifted from one line to the next, and the front rolled hundreds of miles. Then, within months, something no one had truly imagined appeared. A wound, roughly 470 miles long, ran from the North Sea to Switzerland. Trenches, bunkers, belts of wire. The same pattern spread south on the Italian front, along the Isonzo, on the Carso, in the Alps, and in another theater altogether across the beaches and ridges of the Gallipoli Peninsula. On these fronts, more than 10 million soldiers would be counted as dead, wounded, or missing. Generals and politicians kept promising a decisive breakthrough on the Somme, at Verdun, at Gallipoli, on the Isonzo. The cause was not simply bad generals. Why did the first modern war become a war of trenches? In 1914, no European army planned to fight a trench war. Strategy books still spoke the language of the 19th century. The Schlieffen Plan and Plan 17 envisioned great offensives in the open, cavalry to exploit ruptures, and artillery following close behind the infantry. In the opening weeks, it worked that way. The front surged hundreds of miles to the Marne. Then, in September, the Germans were stopped and fell back north behind the Aisne. There, on the chalk heights between Soissons and Reims, the new phenomenon exploded. Under the fire of French and British guns, German units dug continuous trenches into the soft slopes to avoid being massacred. British and French infantry, advancing in the open and being cut down, learned quickly and began to do the same. It wasn't the result of a grand plan. Privates, junior officers, and engineers, under rifle and machine gun fire, threw themselves down and dug deeper and deeper into the ground. It sprang from survival instinct and battlefield decisions taken on the spot. In the months that followed, the so-called race to the sea, French, British, and Germans tried to outflank one another ever farther north. Each failed attempt added yet another stretch of ditches, wire, and firing positions. By the end of 1914, there was, from Switzerland to the North Sea, a nearly continuous belt of fortified lines. Only then did headquarters grasp that trenches were not a temporary accident, but a new form of war. Between 1870 and 1914, military technology raced far ahead of doctrine. Artillery became quick firing, hurled high-explosive shells on curved trajectories, and could strike targets hidden behind ridges and embankments at about 4 to 5 miles. In the Great War, more than 70% of casualties would be caused by artillery. Infantry no longer carried muzzle loaders, but modern bolt-action rifles, able to fire 10 to 15 rounds a minute with good accuracy at about 220 to 330 yards. The machine gun, derived from Maxim's system, changed the equation. Hundreds of rounds a minute from trained crews in prepared positions. A single gun could halt an entire battalion trying to cross open ground. On top of this, armies added barbed wire. Born as a civilian invention for fencing pasture, it was cheap, quick to lay, and hard to clear under fire. From the start of the war, belts of entanglements were spread before the trenches, several yards deep, sometimes dozens of yards deep at key points. The result was an integrated system. Wire slowed and channeled attackers. Machine guns struck them while halted or packed in gaps. Artillery finished the work on clusters and supply routes. Open terrain, the stage for corps-level maneuvers throughout the 19th century, became a killing ground where every yard taken demanded an exorbitant price. In such a context, the defense held a structural edge. To capture 100 yards, the attacker spent lives and shells vastly out of proportion to what the defender needed to hold them. Digging, fortifying, and staying underground ceased to be a stopgap. It was often the only way to live long enough to go on fighting.
Did you know that most people who watch our documentaries aren't subscribed yet? If you enjoy animated maps and history, join our community. Leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next episodes.
A trench line was never a mere ditch. It was a defensive system layered in depth, often stretching about 2/3 of a mile from front to rear. At the very edge sat the firing trenches, with observation posts and sentry bays, sometimes barely 50 yards from the enemy. 2 to 4/10 of a mile behind ran support lines with small reserves, ammunition stacks, ration dumps, dressing posts, and shelters. Farther still lay reserve trenches, rally points, and assembly areas for counterattacks, all linked by communication trenches cut in zigzags to break direct fire. In front of the firing line stood belts of barbed wire, about 15 to 100 feet deep. Their purpose was not simply to stop an assault, but to channel it into predictable lanes already marked on range cards. Machine gun crews covered those gaps with overlapping arcs. Pre-registered artillery could engage any crossing within minutes. Roughly 1.25 to 3 miles behind the front, gun lines waited by roads and light rail spurs. Ranges and angles were pre-noted on maps. A single telephone call could bring a box carriage down on crossroads, bridges, embankments, and likely assembly points. Once the SOS signal went up, batteries shifted from standby to full fire almost automatically. Finally came the backbone of the system: transport. Field railways, horse columns, and motor trucks shuttled men and shells along screened routes. The layout was elastic. Even if the enemy seized a village or drove a salient a mile or two deep, reserves could be rushed in and a new stop line thrown across the breach. That is why the Western Front, from Flanders to Champagne, formed a continuous belt of fortified ground, adapted to local terrain, yet unified by the same logic of depth, wiring, and fire control. Everywhere. Everyone tried to smash the trench system in 1915. No one succeeded. In the spring, the French struck in Artois and Champagne. Days of artillery preparation along narrow fronts. Tens of thousands of shells poured into 1st and 2nd German lines. At Neuve-Chapelle in March, the British massed fire on a sector about 1.25 miles wide, and in the opening minutes, broke through locally. But communications lagged. Orders came late, and the guns could not shift fast enough. Infantry lost touch with the barrage, and open ground fell back under German machine gun control. Counterfire pinned the attackers, and the initiative ebbed away. In April at Ypres, the Germans released chlorine on a broad front, the first real gas attack in the West. A green wall drove Allied units from their positions, yet reserves and counterattacks closed the gap before a decision could be forced. In late September, at Loos, it was the British who opened their own cylinders along roughly 6 miles of front. Shifting winds pushed the cloud into English trenches, sowing confusion. Once again, early gains failed to carry to the second line. The year taught harsh lessons. Artillery could wreck wire and parapets, but only if fire kept pace with the infantry. Forward observers, reliable telephones, and planned rolling barrages were still in their infancy. Reserves stood too far back, roads clogged. Staffs struggled to coordinate attacks beyond the first objective. Where the ground was taken, exhausted units faced fresh German counterattack launched from sheltered reserve trenches. By December, villages like Neuve-Chapelle or Souchez had changed hands, but the Western Front had barely moved. The costs were terrible. The gains countered in orchards, crossroads, and a few contours on the map. Proof that brute force, without new methods, could not break the trench. Between 1915 and 1917, almost every device we associate with modern battle appeared on the Western Front. Chemical agents, flamethrowers, tanks, new gunnery methods, and stormtroop tactics. Each promised a key to the stalemate. None alone could shatter a defense built up from wire, trenches, machine guns, and well-served artillery. Gas terrified and killed. Chlorine and phosphine burned lungs. Later, mustard-drenched ground, blinded men, and contaminated dugouts. Yet gas was a fickle ally. Clouds rode the wind, which spilled into hollows or drifted back over friendly lines. Shell-fired gas improved delivery, but by the time the reserves arrived, the gas's worst effect had often ebbed. Masks and training reduced casualties while doing little to open a clean roadway through the defense. Flamethrowers, introduced in significant numbers by Germany from 1915, were brutal at close range. Assault teams with projectors cleared saps, cellars, and strong points, driving defenders into the open where rifles and bombs finished the job. But crews had to close within 10 or 20 feet, carrying heavy fuel tanks and hoses under fire. It was a specialist weapon measured in yards, not a tool for ripping open miles of front. In 1916, Britain deployed tanks. The first Mark I machines could crush wire and cross craters, yet they were slow, fragile, and scarce. On the Somme, fewer than 50 reached the start line. Many broke down. Where they arrived, they smashed nests that had checked infantry for weeks, but they lacked the numbers, speed, and reliability to exploit success. Still, a seed had been planted. Armored weight combined with gunnery and infantry would one day restore operational movement. Artillery adapted fastest. The creeping barrage, planned to roll forward about 50 to 100 yards every few minutes, kept heads down until the last moment if infantry clung to its edge. Sound ranging and flash spotting found hostile batteries. Counter-battery fired suppressed guns that had cut down every advance. Yet if the barrage outran foot soldiers or drifted in smoke and dust, the screen dissolved and the defense revived. Germany refined infiltration doctrine. Stoßtruppen, trained to bypass strong points and nose through weak seams, pushed grenades and automatic weapons into command posts, artillery parks, and signal or telephone posts in the rear. Their aim was not to occupy every trench, but to unravel the system from within, forcing a line to collapse by sabotage. Aviation multiplied the reach of arms. Photographs mapped trenchworks and wire. Wireless observers corrected barges. Bombers struck railheads and bridges. Air power could not take ground, but it made surprise, rare, and coordination possible. Combined, these tools shaved the defender's advantage without erasing it. The trench endured because the defense was a system, and systems demand more than a single new weapon to fall. By late 1917, the balance that had frozen the Western Front began to crack. Russia's collapse freed divisions for the West, briefly stiffening German lines. The entry of the United States brought manpower, materiel, and credit Berlin could not match. In the spring of 1918, Germany gambled on victory before American strength matured. Short bombardments, gas, and large-scale infiltration opened gaps. Railways hurled reserves forward. For the first time since 1914, the front moved fast, about 6 to 9 miles in a single day. Yet the spearheads outran supply, flanks thinned, and no fresh reserves remained to turn gains into a decisive victory. From July, the Allies seized the initiative. Better gunnery, reliable tanks, and air forces working with infantry produced the 100 Days, a rolling series of blows that collapsed the German position. Trenches no longer ruled the field. The defense had lost the systemic edge it held since 1915. Elsewhere, dynamics differed. In the east, distance allowed withdrawals of hundreds of miles. A continuous wall like France's never formed. On the Italian front, years of mountain stasis ended with only Caporetto and then Vittorio Veneto, when morale, logistics, and maneuver finally aligned. The lesson was stark. Trench warfare arose from a particular balance between firepower, mobility, and supply. When that balance shifted through armor, aircraft, trucks, and doctrine, war began to move again. Verdun and the Somme, Gallipoli and the Isonzo were chapters of one story. Armies hurled forward against systems built to stop them and paid for every yard.
The summer of 1914 marked the tipping point, a moment when Europe unknowingly set itself on a path to devastation. What began as a regional crisis in the Balkans quickly spiraled into a global conflict, fueled by ambition, fear, and entangled alliances. On July 28, Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Serbia ignited a chain reaction, mobilizing over 65 million soldiers and plunging the world into an unprecedented inferno. By 1918, over 16 million were dead, 20 million wounded, empires had crumbled, and the world was forever changed. This war was fought on a massive scale. The Western Front in France and Belgium became a static wasteland of trenches, machine guns, and relentless artillery. The Eastern Front saw vast armies clashing in rapid, deadly advances, while the Italian Alps and Gallipoli brought brutal mountain and amphibious warfare. Beyond Europe, colonial territories in Africa and Asia became battlegrounds, while the seas saw fierce naval warfare, with submarines disrupting vital supply lines. Entire economies transformed into engines of destruction, producing millions of rifles, billions of bullets, and modern weapons like airplanes and tanks. The First World War left no corner of the globe untouched. To understand how diplomacy failed and chaos prevailed is to uncover the story of the Great War's origins. In the decades before the First World War, Europe became entangled in alliances, consumed by nationalism and armed for conflict. By 1914, two major blocs dominated European politics. The Triple Alliance, formed in 1882, united Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Germany sought allies to avoid isolation. Austria-Hungary relied on German support to suppress Slavic nationalism, and Italy, though hesitant and self-interested, aimed to gain territory. Opposing them was the Triple Entente, finalized in 1907, which bound France, Russia, and Britain. France sought protection from Germany after its Franco-Prussian War defeat. Russia aimed to defend Slavic nations in the Balkans, and Britain encountered Germany's growing naval ambitions. These alliances were rooted in fear and distrust. Germany feared encirclement, France wanted revenge, and Alsace-Lorraine, Austria-Hungary struggled with rising nationalism, and Russia saw itself as Serbia's protector. Britain viewed Germany's naval buildup as a threat. Ironically, alliances meant to maintain peace created a system where any regional conflict could spark a global war. Nationalism and imperial ambitions worsened instability. Serbia's goal of uniting Slavs threatened Austria-Hungary, and colonial rivalries between France, Britain and Germany fueled tensions. The arms race made war feel inevitable. Germany and Britain built vast navies of dreadnoughts, while European powers expanded armies and stockpiled weapons like machine guns and artillery. This militarization was like a loaded gun on a hair trigger, where even a small spark could ignite catastrophe. By 1914, Europe was a fragile, volatile continent, primed for disaster. A system designed to deter war instead guaranteed it. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, lit the spark that set Europe ablaze. Austria-Hungary, determined to crush Serbia nationalism and secure its weakening empire, issued an ultimatum to Serbia with demands so harsh they were designed to be rejected. Serbia accepted most terms but refused some critical conditions, prompting Austria-Hungary to declare war on July 28, 1914. This localized conflict quickly escalated due to Europe's fragile alliance system. Russia, viewing itself as the protector of Slavic nations, mobilized its forces to support Serbia. Germany, Austria-Hungary's closest ally, saw Russian mobilization as an act of aggression and declared war on Russia on August 1. 2 days later, Germany declared war on France, Russia's ally. Germany's Schlieffen Plan aimed to quickly defeat France by bypassing its heavily fortified eastern border through neutral Belgium. The plan sought to outflank French defenses, capture Paris, and end the war before turning east to face Russia. However, violating Belgian neutrality inevitably brought Britain into the war. Kaiser Wilhelm II, aware of the danger, tried to avoid escalating the conflict. After conversations with his cousin, King George V of Britain, Wilhelm expressed doubts about invading Belgium, knowing it would provoke British intervention. Yet Germany's military leadership, committed to the Schlieffen Plan, insisted their strategy was already underway and could not be stopped. On August 4, 1914, German troops marched into Belgium, violating international agreements. Britain, in response, declared war on Germany, turning the conflict into a global war. Within a week, Europe's powder keg had exploded. Mobilizations across Europe proved impossible to stop, as treaties and rivalries turned a Balkan crisis into a global conflict. As the war spread, nations around the globe mobilized millions of soldiers, turning the conflict into a worldwide catastrophe. Germany entered with 3.5 million well-trained troops in advanced artillery, executing its Schlieffen Plan against France and Russia. France, fueled by a desire for revenge, deployed 3.7 million soldiers, while Russia raised over 5 million troops, the largest army, but plagued by logistical and leadership weaknesses. Britain, with an initial professional force of 248,000, quickly mobilized over 4 million troops, heavily supported by soldiers from colonies such as India, Australia, and Canada. Italy, initially neutral, joined the Allies in 1915 after the Treaty of London, mobilizing 5.6 million troops to fight on the mountainous Italian front. In October 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, opening critical new fronts in the Middle East. The Gallipoli Campaign saw brutal fighting as Allied forces, including Australian and New Zealand troops, failed to seize the Dardanelles Strait. In Mesopotamia, British forces sought to control oil-rich regions, clashing fiercely with Ottoman troops. Meanwhile, the empire also launched offensives in the Caucasus against Russia and engaged in devastating internal campaigns, including the Armenian genocide, which resulted in over 1 million deaths. These new theaters of war added immense complexity to an already global conflict. Meanwhile, Japan declared war on Germany in 1914, using the opportunity to seize German colonies in China's Shandong Peninsula and the Pacific Islands of Micronesia, asserting its naval dominance in the region. These actions allowed Japan to expand its influence in Asia while aligning with the Allies, further globalizing the conflict. By 1917, the United States, pushed by German unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram, entered the war with 4.7 million soldiers, nearly 2 million of whom were deployed to Europe. The intercepted telegram proposed that Mexico join the Central Powers if the US entered the war, in exchange for German support in reclaiming Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Outraged by this threat and repeated submarine attacks, the US abandoned neutrality. Factories and railroads worldwide churned out weapons and ammunition, fueling an industrialized war unlike any before. By 1918, the conflict involved over 65 million troops, touching every corner of the globe and leaving devastation on an unprecedented scale. The First World War was shaped by the decisions and missteps of its key leaders, many of whom found themselves navigating crises beyond their control. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was known for his impulsiveness and erratic policies. Obsessed with securing Germany's place as a world power, his aggressive militarism and desire for dominance alienated neighboring nations. Yet during the July crisis, Wilhelm hesitated, mistakenly believing the war could be contained after Austria-Hungary's declaration against Serbia. Earlier in the crisis, Wilhelm exchanged a series of personal telegrams with Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, his cousin, in a desperate attempt to prevent war. Calling each other Willie and Nicky, the two monarchs pleaded for restraint, but their efforts were overwhelmed by rigid military plans and mounting political pressures. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia faced a difficult choice. Torn between loyalty to Serbia and his empire's internal instability, he reluctantly authorized mobilization against Austria-Hungary. This decision, however, provoked Germany and escalated the conflict. Nicholas's weak leadership and reliance on outdated advisors further hampered Russia's ability to prepare for war. Franz Joseph, the aging emperor of Austria-Hungary, was desperate to preserve his crumbling empire. Pressured by his advisors, he approved the ultimatum to Serbia, knowing it would likely lead to war. His reliance on German support reflected the empire's inability to act alone in suppressing Balkan nationalism. Across the Atlantic, Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, clung to neutrality for as long as possible. However, German provocations like unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram forced his hand, leading him to declare war in 1917. The July crisis highlighted the dangerous miscalculations of European leaders. Many believed war could be controlled and short-lived. Instead, their overconfidence and mismanagement unleashed a conflict of unprecedented scale, proving that even small decisions can have catastrophic consequences. The First World War destroyed entire generations. Over 16 million died, and 20 million were wounded. Battles like the Somme and Verdun caused over 1 million casualties each, gaining little ground. Civilians suffered immensely. Towns like Ypres and Verdun were reduced to ruins. Millions of refugees fled advancing armies and famines, such as Germany's turnip winter of 1916-17, devastated entire populations. The war reshaped the 20th century. Empires fell, borders were redrawn, and seeds of future conflicts like World War II were sown. The First World War serves as a warning of how fear and ambition can lead to global catastrophe. But how could such devastation happen if no one truly wanted the war? At dawn on September 5, 1914, a single torpedo ripped into the British cruiser HMS Pathfinder near the Firth of Forth in eastern Scotland. In that instant, German submarine U-21 signaled a radical shift in naval warfare. Battleships and cruisers were no longer the only masters of the sea. Submarines, stealthy, precise, and devastating, had arrived. Over the following weeks, a string of lightning-fast attacks drove home this chilling new reality. Over the next few weeks, Germany's U-boats delivered a series of lightning-fast attacks that drove home this chilling new reality. On September 22, just off the Dutch coast, U-9 torpedoed HMS Abu Qir. Then, while rescue operations were still underway, struck again, sinking HMS Hogue and later HMS Cressy. Less than 1 month later, on October 15, U-9 targeted another cruiser in northern waters, HMS Hawke, adding to the rising Allied casualties. Then, on October 18, U-27 shocked observers by sinking the British submarine E-3 in a rare sub-on-sub encounter. By late October, 6 Allied vessels had been sent to the bottom in a span of just over 6 weeks, claiming more than 2,200 lives. Each attack underscored one daunting truth: no ship, whether on the surface or beneath it, was safe from Germany's stealthy undersea threat. Thus began the world's first true submarine war, an era in which underwater technology would dominate the oceans, and every admiral's worst nightmare would lurk just below the waves. Long before steel-hulled U-boats prowled the seas, the first seeds of underwater warfare were planted during the American Revolutionary War. In 1776, a tiny one-manned craft called the Turtle attempted to stealthily attach explosives to British warships. Though it ultimately failed, the Turtle's design introduced core concepts: ballast systems, manual propulsion, and submerged attacks that would inspire future inventors. Fast forward to the US Civil War, where the H.L. Hunley gained fame as the first submarine to sink an enemy vessel. In 1864, it torpedoed the USS Housatonic off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. Yet this triumph quickly turned tragic when the Hunley itself disappeared soon after, taking its entire crew to the ocean floor. Despite these grim setbacks, both the Turtle and the Hunley proved a crucial point. Stealth and submersion held enormous potential in naval combat. Their legacy laid the groundwork for more advanced, diesel-powered submarines of the early 1900s. Lethal, far-reaching, and built for stealth, by 1914, Germany fielded around 30 operational U-boats, each designed with long-range capabilities and surface speeds of about 15 knots. Coupled with an operational depth nearing 100 meters, these submarines could strike convoys or warships far from home bases, then slip beneath most Allied responses. Their advanced torpedoes and deck guns made them a dual threat in any theater, whether patrolling the North Sea or venturing into the Atlantic. Although Britain boasted a larger force, roughly 74 submarines, they were geared toward coastal defense, limiting their oceanic reach. France, with around 50 vessels, and the United States, with about 20, also tended to emphasize local waters, leaving no direct match for U-boats' lethal mix of range, firepower, and stealth. Early in the conflict, that combination gave Germany's submarines an undeniable advantage at sea, redefining how modern navies would wage war below the surface. As the war progressed, submarine fleets soared across all major powers. Germany's U-boat force rose from around 30 to over 100, bolstered by extra torpedo tubes and heavier deck guns, while Britain built more than 120 submarines, many still geared for coastal defense. France and the United States expanded as well, though largely in home waters. This intensified arms race at sea cemented the submarine's role as a pivotal weapon capable of reshaping global naval power. By early 1915, Germany had fully embraced unrestricted submarine warfare around the British Isles, designating any vessel, whether enemy or neutral, as a valid target. The objective was to choke off Britain's maritime supply lines, effectively starving the island nation into submission. The most infamous attack occurred on May 7, when U-20 torpedoed the RMS Lusitania off Ireland's southern coast, killing nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. Just days earlier, on March 3, U-28 sank the British cruiser HMS Acasta, heightening the sense of vulnerability among Allied naval forces. These brutal assaults provoked global outrage and intensified anti-German sentiment, pushing the United States closer to open involvement in the conflict. Meanwhile, German U-boats also ventured into the Mediterranean, while Allied transports in the Aegean Sea faced continuous danger, especially during the Gallipoli Campaign, where any disruption to supply routes could prove disastrous. Britain and France hurried to defend these critical passages, intensifying naval patrols and experimenting with early anti-submarine measures, from underwater mines to rudimentary hydrophones. Thus, the race to counter Germany's growing undersea threat began in earnest. By 1916, Germany was fielding a new generation of longer-range U-boats, such as the U-19 class, capable of extended patrols in the North Atlantic and even threatening waters off North America. These improved vessels featured enhanced diesel engines, deeper diving limits, and greater torpedo capacity, magnifying Germany's ability to strike at vital Allied shipping lanes. In response, the Allies introduced early hydrophones, primitive underwater listening devices, to detect submarine propellers, while destroyers and armed trawlers conducted more frequent patrols along known transit routes. Diplomatically, the SS Sussex incident in March 1916, where a French ferry was torpedoed with American citizens on board, provoked intense international pressure. Germany briefly moderated its attacks to avoid further antagonizing the United States, but tensions continued to simmer. As both sides adapted, the undersea battlefield grew more unpredictable. Germany's upgraded U-boats tested Allied defenses, while each new Allied countermeasure forced the German Navy to refine tactics yet again. Early in 1917, Germany intensified its U-boat campaign by resuming unrestricted submarine warfare in the North Atlantic. No longer issuing warnings, German submarines attacked all vessels, aiming to sever Britain's crucial lifelines and force a swift Allied collapse. As a result, Allied shipping losses surged, often exceeding 500,000 tons per month. Amid these mounting threats, diplomatic chaos erupted with the interception of the Zimmermann telegram in January 1917, in which Germany encouraged Mexico to reclaim lost territories from the United States if it joined the Central Powers. This revelation, coupled with ongoing submarine attacks on American vessels, pushed U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to ask Congress for a declaration of war. On April 6, 1917, the United States officially entered the conflict, throwing its vast industrial and military resources behind the Allies. To combat rampant U-boat attacks, the Allies introduced the convoy system, grouping merchant ships under dedicated naval escorts. Armed destroyers employed depth charges, canisters set to explode at predetermined depths, forcing submarines to surface or flee. Additionally, the Otranto Barrage, an extensive minefield and naval blockade at the Strait of Otranto between Italy and Albania, was established to prevent Austro-Hungarian and German submarines from accessing the wider Mediterranean Sea. These measures, along with tighter intelligence sharing and more coordinated maritime patrols, helped reduce losses and gradually eroded Germany's underwater advantage, though the threat of the U-boat remained potent well into 1918. By 1918, Allied countermeasures against German U-boats had reached a new level of effectiveness. The convoy system, now fully established, drastically lowered merchant shipping losses by placing entire fleets under the watchful eyes of armed escorts and destroyers equipped with depth charges. Meanwhile, extensive mine barrages in the North Sea, particularly the massive northern barrage between Scotland and Norway, choked off vital U-boat passageways. Early forms of aerial reconnaissance also contributed, spotting submarines near the surface or pinpointing likely routes. As Germany's attack options dwindled, mounting U-boat losses undermined its once formidable underwater advantage. Throughout the war, German U-boats launched over 55,000 torpedo attacks, sinking more than 5,000 Allied ships. Resupply and crew replacement became increasingly difficult, with morale plummeting as missions turned into desperate gambles. By autumn, Germany was on the verge of collapse on both land and sea. Under the terms of the armistice, German U-boats were surrendered or scuttled, marking the end of an intense campaign that had reshaped naval warfare worldwide. By the war's end, over 5,000 Allied ships had been sunk, yet Germany lost more than 200 U-boats in the process, demonstrating both the power and vulnerability of undersea warfare. The submarine's impact accelerated sonar research and improved torpedo design, setting the stage for modern anti-submarine tactics. Mines, hydrophones, and convoy systems would all evolve rapidly in the post-war years, forever transforming naval strategy. These developments foreshadowed an even larger U-boat campaign during World War II, when newer technologies and global reach would make submarine warfare more decisive and devastating than ever before.
"1915, the second year of the Great War. Leaders in London and Paris were looking for a shortcut. Strike the Ottoman Empire, open the Dardanelles, resupply Russia, and perhaps bring down what many call the sick man of Europe. Target: a strip of land 50 miles long and 12 miles wide, the Gallipoli Peninsula at the mouth of the Dardanelles. It controls the passage to the Sea of Marmara into Constantinople. Against Ottoman troops, advised by Germans, comes an army from many lands: British, French, Anzac Australians and New Zealanders, Indian units, North Africans, Senegalese. From April 1915 to January 1916, to hold or seize those coastal hills, the Allies lost over 250,000. The Ottomans, about the same. In all, 500,000 were put out of action. The campaign hardened into trenches, bombardments, bloody raids, and dawn assaults against wire and machine guns. Each push cost hundreds of lives for gains of a few hundred yards. How did so many lives get sacrificed for a peninsula that, in the planners' minds, was meant as the quick move to shorten the war? At the outbreak of war in 1914, the Ottoman Empire was still formally neutral. It was a tired empire. It had lost provinces, its army needed rebuilding, and the economy was fragile. In Constantinople, the Young Turks sought a way to strengthen the state and keep it from collapse. To succeed, they desperately needed a great power as an ally. They found it in Berlin. Germany offered military instructors, naval advisors, modern weapons, and financial credit. In the summer, 2 German cruisers, Goeben and Breslau, evaded the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean and took refuge in Constantinople. They changed their names to fly the Ottoman flag, yet still remained in practice under German command. At the end of October 1914, those ships bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea. The response was immediate. Russia, France, and Great Britain declared war on the Ottoman Empire. From that moment, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles were closed. Russia was cut off from supplies and exports. Without Russian grain and vital industrial materials, London feared a crisis at home. And on the Eastern Front, the Russian army seemed at risk of buckling under the war's weight. That is why, in 1915, the idea arose to strike at the Straits. If the Ottoman defenses along the Straits could be broken and Constantinople brought under threat, the route to Russia could be reopened and the Central Powers deprived of an ally in a single blow. Against this backdrop, Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, pressed for a naval solution, a great fleet forcing the Straits to open the road to Constantinople. Turning those plans into orders was General Sir Ian Hamilton, commanding the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, with French counterparts beside him. Facing them was the Ottoman Fifth Army under the German officer Lehmann von Sanders and the Young Turk leader Enver Pasha, determined to prove that the empire could still resist and to restore its national prestige at home and abroad. Before risking a landing, the Allies tried to win with ships alone. From February and March 1915, Allied squadrons entered the Dardanelles to batter the Ottoman forts, sweeping mines by night and exchanging fire by day across the narrow channel. It was Churchill's operation. Admiral John de Robeck led the fleet, while General Ian Hamilton prepared the landing force. On the other side stood the Ottoman Fifth Army under the German leader Lehmann von Sanders. Minefields and mobile batteries guarded the Strait's tight turns and headlands from the hidden positions. Initial bombardments knocked out several posts, and in London, hopes of a swift victory rose. On 18 March, the great attempt came. French battleships led, British dreadnoughts followed, and the fleet drove into the Narrows. but under the water waited fresh mine lines. Within hours, the French Bouvet capsized. HMS Irresistible and HMS Ocean were lost. Other ships were damaged. The fleet withdrew, badly battered, and confidence cracked. By evening, the strait was closed. The plan to force the Dardanelles with a navy alone had failed. Losses were high, forts stood, and mines were relaid. If the straits were to open, soldiers had to go ashore. On 25 April 1915, at dawn off Gallipoli, more than 120 Allied ships are already in position. Within a few hours, about 70,000 men will be put ashore. British, French, Australians, New Zealanders, and Indian and North African units. On paper, the operation is under Sir Ian Hamilton, but in the chaos of the landings, field commanders matter. At Cape Helles, General Aylmer Hunter Weston leads the British. The French contingent is under General Albert d'Aumont. Farther north, the Australian and New England Army Corps, ANZAC, is commanded by General William Birdwood, a British officer highly esteemed by his men. British planners use codes, not Turkish place names. The beaches at Cape Helles become V, W, X, Y, and S. To the staff, they are only letters on a map. To those stepping from the boats, V and W will mean sand strewn with bodies. At Cape Helles, the British 29th Division and French units come ashore to push for the hills. At places like V Beach, infantry are cut down, trying only to cross about 10 to 15 of shallow water and barbed wire. Farther north, the Anzacs arrive. For many, it is their first contact with Europe. They have crossed more than 12,000 miles of sea from Australia and New Zealand. In 1915, the Corps fields a little over 50,000 men. By the end of the campaign, Australia and New Zealand will count about 34,000 dead and wounded. Opposite them stand about 80 to 90,000 Ottoman soldiers of the Fifth Army. They are no better equipped, but they hold the heights and know the ground. One commander, Mustafa Kemal, immediately sees the critical point above the Anzacs. He halts retreating units, deploys them on the crests, and sends them to meet the Australians and New Zealanders climbing. By evening, the Allies hold only narrow bridgeheads on the coast. The Ottomans have lost entire battalions to block them. The war of maneuver has already become a war of trenches. At the start of summer, the front is almost motionless. Allied troops, British, French, Anzac, Indian, and North African, are compressed into a strip of ground that in many places extends no more than about 1.25 miles inland from the landing beaches. Opposite them, the Ottoman Fifth Army holds the crests, Achi Baba in the south, the heights above the Anzac sector, a chain of hills from which almost every movement can be watched and struck. In some sectors, the trenches are so close that less than 100 feet, about 30 yards, separate one line from the other. At night, hand grenades fly back and forth like balls between two teams. For the Allies, the problem is simple and terrible. Behind them lies the sea. Ahead, the ground rises toward the Ottoman positions. There are no real rear areas. Depots, aid posts, and kitchens all lie within artillery range. The Ottomans, for their part, lack limitless resources, scant supplies, few machine guns, uneven armament. What compensates are altitude and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Oppressive heat, water in short supply, flies everywhere. Bodies left between the lines sour the air and spread diseases that strike Turks and Allies alike. In this environment, the smell of the dead sometimes imposes a truce. On 24 May 1915, after a major Ottoman attack failed before the Anzac positions, the ground between the trenches lay carpeted with corpses. For several hours, the two armies suspended fire to bury them. Australians, New Zealanders, and Ottoman soldiers worked just tens of yards apart, exchanged cigarettes, and studied one another in silence. Then, at the agreed signal, each returned to its trench. The assaults do not cease. The Allies repeatedly attack villages and heights such as Karithia and Achibaba. The Ottomans answer with counterattacks just as bloody. Each time, the balance is the same. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of casualties, only to gain a few dozen or a few hundred meters. In August 1915, the Allies gambled on one last great attempt to unlock Gallipoli. The plan was a pincer, a new landing site at Sulva Bay on the peninsula's northwest coast, while the Anzac pressed for the Sari Bear Heights, with key objectives like Chunuk Bear and Hill 971 anchoring the ridge, and a plan designed to split the Ottoman defenses and open the road inland. Suvla was chosen because the ground looked more forgiving, a broad, sandy bay with low hills within. In the first hours of 7 August, at least 20,000 men of the British 9th Corps came ashore, to grow beyond 60,000 in the following days. On paper, the task was simple: seize the heights around the bay quickly and then push south toward Anzac's lines. In practice, General Frederick Stopford's headquarters, directing the operation from his ship, proved slow and hesitant. Orders arrived late, reconnaissance was scant, and battalions lingered near the shore, while farther east, Australians and New Zealanders climbed toward Sari Bear Ridge. For the Ottomans, it was the most dangerous moment of the campaign. If the Allies took the spine, they could dominate most of the peninsula. The Anafarta sector was entrusted to Mustafa Kemal, who scraped together everything he had: tired battalions, hurried reserves, light guns dragged up the hills. To his men of the 57th Regiment, he spoke the line that became famous: "I do not order you to attack. I order you to die." The New Zealanders managed to raise their flag on Chinook Bear for only a few hours. Other heights changed hands repeatedly among hand-to-hand fighting and night assaults. But Ottoman counterattacks, launched downhill from the crests, in the end drove the Allies back almost everywhere. When the fighting faded, Suvla and Anzac sector had only gained small salients in exchange for tens of thousands of casualties in just a few days. The last great maneuver failed. Gallipoli remained blocked. With autumn, Gallipoli changes its face. The rains turn the ground to mud and stone. Trenches cut into dry earth filled with water. Shelters cave in. Then the cold arrives. Many on both sides have neither blankets nor proper boots. Frostbite appears. Disease spreads. For the Allies, rough seas often block supply lighters. For the Ottomans, every crate of ammunition must be dragged up slippery slopes under artillery threat. After months of failed assaults, no one sees a real military way out. In the capitals, the verdict is merciless. In London and Paris, the Dardanelles campaign is deemed a blind alley, costly in men and ships. In Britain, responsibility falls on Winston Churchill, for whom the Dardanelles have already cost the Admiralty, and who is pushed to the margins of government. To decide what to do, London sends a new commander, General Charles Munro. His report is glacial. He recommends complete evacuation. Admiral Rosslyn Weymouth is charged with organizing it in secret. At the end of 1915, the evacuation begins. First, the Anzac positions in Suvla Bay sector, in the northwest of the peninsula. In January 1916, Cape Helles, too, the southern tip from which the landings had started. The retreat is prepared in detail. Units thinned little by little, fires left burning, rifles modified to fire by themselves while the last men embarked in silence. It is the paradox of Gallipoli. The best executed operation is the escape, with minimal losses. For Churchill, that distant peninsula remained a personal wound. In 1916, humiliated, he chose to enlist again and command a battalion on the Western Front, before returning to the political stage as the leader the world would come to know in the Second World War.
And in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
When the last Allied soldier left Gallipoli in January 1916, the reckoning is that of a slaughter. The Allies have suffered more than 250,000 casualties, dead, wounded, and missing. The Ottoman army, a similar number. In all, over 500,000 men were put out of action for a campaign that opened no straits, did not force Turkey from the war, and scarcely altered the balance on the main front in Europe itself. For the Ottoman Empire, however, Gallipoli was a great defensive victory. An army assumed to be weak repelled a coalition of French warships, British infantry, Anzac troops, and colonial units from India and Africa. The name of Mustafa Kemal became the emblem of a new leadership. In the decades that followed, it was seen as one of the foundations of the Turkish Republic. For the Allies, it was a shock. In Britain and France, Gallipoli remained a byword for a plan brilliant on paper, but disastrous on the ground. For Australia and New Zealand, it was where an identity was born. The Anzac Corps became a national myth, and 25 April, Anzac Day, is still a day of remembrance. Decades later, Ataturk, the former enemy, told Anzac mothers, "Your sons now rest here in Turkish soil. They are no longer strangers. They have become and will be our sons." (1916), the third year of the Great War. Politicians and generals promise a decisive victory, the end of the slaughter. In reality, they are preparing a year of great illusions and of the worst carnage imaginable. On the Western Front, a scar runs almost 465 miles from the North Sea to Switzerland. Yet the epicenter of this hell is neither a capital nor a great industrial city, but a small bend of the Meuse around a provincial French town, Verdun. Here, from February 21 to December 1916, Germans and French soldiers butcher one another for a few miles of torn, devastated ground. In all, more than 700,000 men were killed, wounded, or listed as missing. 10 months of fire, mud, and steel for a front line that, in the end, lies almost where it began. French soldiers sum it up this way: if you have not seen Verdun, you have seen nothing of the war. On this narrow scrap of ground, in barely 5 months, about 30 million shells would fall. In the end, the reckoning is simple and terrible. 6 dead for every 3 yards of line. Long before 1916, Verdun was a symbol. In distant 843, here a treaty was signed that split Charlemagne's empire into 3 kingdoms. 2 of them would become, more or less, France and Germany. In 1792, the fortress of Verdun fell under the blow of the Prussians, at war with revolutionary France. In 1870, it was besieged again in the Franco-Prussian War. Its capitulation opened the road to the French defeat and left a scar on national pride. In 1916, Verdun was a town on the Meuse, sent in a salient, a bulge in the French lines and a dent in the German ones, ringed by around 20 forts. On paper, it was an impregnable stronghold, yet the garrison had about 20,000 men, and many forts were almost empty. Much of the heavy artillery had been moved elsewhere for the 1915 offensives. For Erich von Falkenhayn, it was the perfect target. Precious to France, yet exposed enough to be struck from 3 sides. The plan was simple and brutal. Hit Verdun, force the French, for pride more than strategy, to commit their reserves there, then grind them down with artillery in a long battle of attrition. On 12 February 1916, the Germans were ready to strike Verdun. Batteries in position, infantry deployed on both banks of the Meuse. But snow and ice froze the sector. Roads became impassable. Surprise vanished. For days, the troops stayed in shelters while the French, once they grasped the danger, strengthened the sector with new trenches and divisions. At dawn on 21 February, the weather improved. Shortly after 7:15 a.m., about 850 German guns opened fire on the French positions. The bombardment lasted 9 hours. Trenches pulverized, woods uprooted, hills turned into fields of craters. Men and mud became indistinguishable. It was the storm of steel, the deliberate, systematic destruction that industrial war could unleash on roughly 2 miles of front. When the fire slackened, the infantry moved in. The principle was always the same. Artillery conquers, infantry occupies. On a front of 14 kilometers, roughly 9 miles, on the right bank of the Meuse, around 140,000 German infantry advanced in waves under the orders of Crown Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, son of the Kaiser and commander of the Fifth Army, a young officer considered intelligent and backed by an experienced staff. In the Bois de Coeur, just over 1,200 chasseurs under Colonel Émile Giant faced them almost surrounded. They were crushed by fire, but slowed the advance and bought precious hours for the French defense. The Germans were not only more numerous, they also wielded new and deadly weapons. They used flamethrowers on French positions and made extensive use of fighter and reconnaissance aircraft. In their Verdun sector, they concentrated several dozen machines, roughly twice the French strength. Many were the latest generation single-seat fighters with synchronized machine guns firing through the propeller arc. The French replied with Nieuports and other lighter, more maneuverable biplanes, but they were less protected and relied more on rudimentary armament. In the first days, the initiative remained German. Their squadrons ruled the sky over Verdun and covered an advance that by evening had opened a gap up to almost 4 miles, deep in the French lines. The front was shattered, entire units wiped out, yet Verdun had not fallen. Fort Douaumont is the keystone of Verdun's defensive system, the largest fort and the one pushed farthest toward the German lines. On paper, it is the position that must never fall, the concrete and earth anchor of the whole sector. To French planners, it is the cornerstone of the whole shield. Yet after 3 days of bombardment, contradictory reports, and confused orders, on 25 February 1916, it falls almost without a fight. That day, a detachment of the 24th Brandenburg Regiment worked its way up to the fort among shell craters and half-destroyed outworks. Inside, there are very few defenders and almost no heavy artillery. The big guns have been removed months earlier to serve on other fronts. The Germans find open hatches and unguarded entrances, slip inside practically without firing. A single platoon, moving through dark passages and stairways, is enough to seize the bastion that is supposed to symbolize Verdun's resistance. For the garrison, the disaster feels both sudden and absurd to everyone involved. For Berlin, It is a triumph. The breach in the ring of forts seems to fling open the road to the city. Crown Prince Wilhelm of Prussia comes to Douaumont to offer congratulations. Imperial communiques celebrate the fall of the most powerful French fort. For France, it is a brutal blow to morale. The propaganda machine tries to minimize the loss, but in Paris it is obvious that Verdun stands on the edge of disaster. A few months later, in May 1916, an explosion in the ammunition stores inside Douaumont will kill hundreds of German soldiers. The fort, taken almost without a shot, claims its own delayed blood tribute from the occupiers. Meanwhile, the town below is hammered by a huge 15-inch naval gun mounted on a railway carriage. Its shells devastate the center, smash the cathedral, and level entire districts. The civilian population flees inland. Verdun reels and empties, turned into a bleak military landscape. At this point, the French High Command intervenes. General de Castelnau sends a simple order. Not 1 inch of ground is to be given up. Joffre recalls Philippe Pétain, gives him command of the Second Army and the task of holding Verdun at any cost. Commanders repeat, "Ils ne passeront pas." They shall not pass. And Pétain urges his troops on with "Courage, on les aura." Courage, we will beat them. This time, France has decided that Verdun will not fall. Philippe Pétain is an unusual general. Cautious, methodical, little inclined to offensives for honor. He repeats that men must not be thrown against a machine, that fire kills. At Verdun, he turns this idea into a defensive system organized in detail. To withstand the German blow, he starts with supply. He has a country road of 47 miles between Bar-le-Duc and Verdun repaired. It will become the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. Along that artery, day and night, up to 6,000 trucks carry ammunition and food. During the battle, 2 million men travel on it, rotated in and out of the sector. Around the town, Pétain has the surviving forts rearmed, restores the batteries, and strengthens artillery positions. The French 75s are joined by heavier pieces able to answer German guns. Divisions are fed into a rotation. Exhausted units are pulled out and replaced by fresher formations. It is not kindness, it is calculation. He knows that if he leaves the same troops too long in that sector, Verdun will give way from nervous collapse before it does from lack of men. In their diaries, the soldiers no longer write, "We are going on the attack," but "We are going to work." Laying barbed wire, digging, repairing trenches, hauling shells through the mud. Day and night blur. Men live among water, earth, rats, and corpses that cannot be recovered. Verdun does not collapse in a single blow. It stiffens and turns into a living fortress fed by trucks, rails, and artillery. The Battle of Attrition, conceived to break France, begins to work, but yard by yard it wears down the German army. On the left bank of the Meuse, the battle focuses on 2 heights, Hill 304 and Mortagne, Dead Man's Hill. The Germans commit 26 divisions and, after months of fighting, takes 1 fort and a few stretches of trench. The hills turn into fields of craters. The geography is erased. The war also moves underground. Both armies dig trenches and galleries, while military miners work beneath no man's land. On the surface, many bodies remain where they fell, because to recover them means exposing oneself to fire. Mud, rats, and decay turn the front into a cemetery where the living share ground with the dead. To artillery and flamethrowers is added phosphine gas, which burns the lungs and kills. Constant bombardments, gas, and machine guns transform Verdun into serial death, compared by historians to an assembly line applied to soldiers' bodies. In this setting comes the drama of Fort Vaux. On 7 June 1916, the Germans launched the final assault in the fort's tunnels. Major Sylvain Reynal's garrison holds out until the water runs out. For 15 days, the men drink urine and lick moisture from the walls. The last call for help is entrusted to a pigeon that crosses the front and dies poisoned. It will receive the Légion d'honneur. Reynal, with no more men or ammunition, surrenders, and the Crown Prince grants him military honors. Fort Vaux falls, but becomes the symbol of Verdun. Hundreds of dead on both sides for a few concrete rooms that are now nothing more than an underground tomb. On 1 July 1916, the Battle of the Somme opens, an Anglo-French offensive designed to ease the pressure on Verdun by forcing the Germans to shift artillery and divisions towards Picardy. On the first day, the British lose 20,000 men, and the German army is hit hard. For Falkenhayn, the problem is clear. He can no longer bleed France white at Verdun without the same time bleeding Germany, between Verdun and the Somme. Losses are too high. Attrition is mutual. By late June, the last German attack on Verdun finally falls. In August, on the Kaiser's orders, Falkenhayn is removed and replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff. The trap designed to break France has now completely closed on the German army. On the French side, after months of defense, command changes. Pétain, the man of Verdun, is promoted. In his place comes General Robert Nivelle, flanked by Charles Mangin, nicknamed the Butcher for his ruthlessness with his troops. The goal is no longer to hold. In the autumn of 1916, the French command prepares a counteroffensive, massing dozens of heavy batteries until the balance of fire, which in February was in German hands, is reversed. On 19 October, the attack begins. In a few days, hundreds of thousands of shells are fired, a density comparable to the German opening of the battle. On 24 October, the infantry moves back into Fort Douaumont, the symbol of the February disaster, taking thousands of German prisoners and capturing dozens of guns along the sector. At the start of November, the Germans, worn down, evacuate Fort Vaux, which the French reoccupy soon afterward. From that moment, a series of limited attacks progressively reduces the German salient at Verdun. After 10 months of fighting, on 19 December 1916, the Inferno of Verdun is finally declared over. By the end of 1916, the reckoning at Verdun is that of a slaughter. 378,000 French casualties, of which 162,000 dead, and 330,000 German casualties, with 143,000 dead. In all, 710,000 lives broken. In just over 5 months, 30 million shells have been fired. Someone will do the math and speak of 6 dead for every yard of front. For the French, Verdun becomes the saved battle. For many Germans, especially after the war, it remains the symbol of an army that was not beaten in the field, but worn down to exhaustion. Around the town, 9 villages erased from the map are never rebuilt, and the Douaumont ossuary gathers the remains of more than 130,000 soldiers, French and German together. Decades later, in 1984, the presidents Mitterrand and Kohl will stand hand in hand in the rain, turning a symbol of war into one of reconciliation. July 1, 1916. At dawn along the Somme River, 750,000 Allied soldiers, British and French, wait for the whistle to signal attack on a front 25 miles long. For a week, their artillery has pounded the German lines. Commanders are convinced almost no one could have survived. On the other side, in trenches and bunkers dug over months, about 300,000 German soldiers wait in silence. They have spent a week under a bombardment that has hurled more than 1 million shells, but thanks to underground shelters, many units remain intact. At 7:30, the British climb from the trenches, advancing at a walk, loaded with full kit. Within a few hours, 58,000 men are hit. Nearly 20,000 die. It is the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army, and the front has moved a few dozen yards. For the Germans, that July 1 seems a defensive victory. Yet in the months that follow, the Somme will devour them all. One German officer will call it the grave of our army. How do you lose 1 million men for a handful of miles of mud? At the end of 1915, the Somme was not conceived as a British battle. It was an idea of the French High Command. At Chantilly, General Joffre proposed an offensive in this sector, where the British and French forces met and railways allowed men and guns to be massed. Their plan called for 40 French divisions, roughly 500,000 men, with a more limited British contribution. Then, in February, Verdun exploded. The French divisions promised for the Somme fell from 40 to 5, and in the attack, first scheduled for August, was brought forward to July to ease pressure on the Meuse. Suddenly, the Somme became the trial of strength for the British Army. The British Expeditionary Force was commanded by General Douglas Haig, a cavalry officer convinced that only a great offensive could break the deadlock. The assault on the Somme would be launched by General Henry Rawlinson's Fourth Army, which had to employ the new volunteer formations, Kitchener's New Armies. Here, the British Army was unrecognizable compared with 1914. Before the war, it numbered about 250,000 professionals and 6 infantry divisions designed for colonial wars. By 1916, thanks to the new armies, more than 1 million soldiers were in France, organized into dozens of divisions. Volunteers often recruited in groups from the same town, factory, or neighborhood. They had uniforms and rifles, but little combat experience. On the other side, the sector was held by Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria's army group and, on the ground, by General Fritz von Bellow's Second Army. Over the years, the Germans had turned that rural zone into a deep defense. Trench lines, concrete bunkers, yard-thick belts of wire, and machine gun nests with fields of fire already registered. They knew the attack would come. The idea was simple. Every yard of ground had to be paid for dearly. From June 24, 1916, for 7 days running, the 25 miles of front line on the Somme had turned into a furnace of fire. The Allies unleashed a bombardment that, at its peak, reached 3 rounds a second. More than 1,000 guns hurled over 1 million shells at the German positions. The stated goal was simple and illusory at the same time: to cut the wire, smash the trenches, and bury the machine guns in their nests. But British artillery had 2 serious problems. Many rounds were still shrapnel, shells that burst in the air, throwing a cloud of lead balls designed to cut down men in the open. This kind of ammunition belonged to wars before 1914, when enemies advanced across open fields. Against deep belts of wire and concrete bunkers, it was almost useless. On top of that, up to a third of the shells were duds that failed to explode or went off badly, leaving wire and shelters intact. The Germans noticed. In some places, they mocked the British with little boards offering to hand back the unexploded ammunition. Meanwhile, under the surface, another war was being fought. Royal Engineer tunnelers had driven at least 17 galleries beneath the German lines. In one of them, at Lochnagar, they packed 26 tons of explosive, enough to lift an entire hill. To Allied headquarters, after such a week and with mines of that power, no one could possibly have survived in the German trenches. In the concrete bunkers beyond no man's land, thousands of German infantry waited for the bombardment to end. At dawn on July 1, after 7 days of fire, an unnatural silence settles for a few minutes over the Somme front. Then, just before 0 hour, the ground erupts again. Beneath several German positions, the great mines laid by British sappers blow. At Lochnagar, 26 tons of explosive tear open a crater about 300 feet across and more than 65 feet deep. It is the signal. Among Allied headquarters, many are convinced that after such a bombardment and mines of that power, there can be no living enemy left ahead. At 7:30, along roughly 25 miles of front, 13 British divisions and 5 French divisions received the order to leave their trenches. In many sectors, British units advance in line, at walking pace, carrying 55 to 65 pounds of equipment: rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, rations. The distances to cover run from about 400 yards to more than a mile. To run would be suicidal. They would arrive exhausted. So officers order them to advance in good order, convinced they will find only ruins. Reality is different. In many places, the wire is almost intact, and German machine gunners have returned to their position within minutes of the barrage lifting. When the dark figures of the British rise from no man's land, Maxim guns and other German machine guns open fire along already registered lines. In some zones, the first waves are cut down within minutes. By day's end, the British Army has about 58,000 casualties, of whom nearly 20,000 are dead. Medical reports will say that only about 39% of the fallen were killed by rifle and machine gun bullets, while nearly 60% died under heavy artillery, often without ever coming within range of a German trench. Entire PALS battalions, men from the same town, the same factory, the same football club, are destroyed in a single morning. On the southern part of the front, however, the picture is different. Here, 5 French divisions attack, backed by more heavy artillery and with more limited objectives. In some sectors, they advance a mile or more, taking villages and several trench lines. They also suffer several thousand casualties on the first day, but far fewer than the British. For the Germans, overall, July 1 is a grim defensive victory, even though they themselves suffered about 10,000 dead, wounded, and missing. The line holds. The strength of their positions is confirmed. And at the same time, it becomes clear that in a war like this, holding the front means turning the battlefield into a slaughterhouse for everyone. In the days after July 1, neither army stops. The British realize the clean breakthrough has failed, and the Somme turns into a series of local attacks, village by village. La Boisselle, Contalmaison, Mametz, Fricourt. Each advance costs hundreds, sometimes thousands of men for a few hundred yards of ruined fields and trenches. Between late July and August, 2 places were carved into the memory of British troops: Pozières and Deville Wood. At Pozières, on the ridge overlooking the road to Bapaume, 3 Australian divisions take turns. Within a few weeks, under constant shelling and German counterattacks, the Australians suffer about 23,000 casualties, almost as many as they had lost at Gallipoli in 8 months. The village and crest are taken, lost, and retaken in a spiral of blows and counterblows that grinds down men on both sides. A little farther east, in Delville Wood, a South African brigade receives the order to hold at all costs. About 3,000 go in. Only a few hundred will come out alive. For the Germans, too, the wood becomes a slaughterhouse. Assaults and counter-assaults cost them several thousand casualties in a few weeks. The wood is pulverized and renamed Devil's Wood. Overall, between July and August, German losses along the Somme sector rise to tens of thousands of men, comparable to British casualties over the same period. For the High Command in Berlin, it becomes clear that defense means more than companies erased, veteran non-commissioned officers lost, and divisions stripped from other fronts, even from Verdun, to plug the gaps and to keep the line intact. September 1916. After 2 months of attrition, Haig looks for a way to unlock the Somme with something other than yet another infantry wave. On September 15, in the Flers-Courcelette sector, he brings a new weapon into action for the first time, the tank. He had wanted 150 of them ready by July 1. In September, he receives 49. Many break down before reaching the start line. Others bog in the mud. In the end, only about 20 move forward with the infantry. These are Mark I machines, steel boxes crawling at 3 to 4 miles an hour, armed with 57mm guns or only machine guns in the lighter versions. For the British, they are still prototypes, full of flaws. For German infantrymen who suddenly see them looming out of smoke, crushing the wire and appearing above the trenches, they are a shock. In some sectors, frontline companies panic and pull back at a run. Yet the picture remains limited. Many tanks are stopped by artillery or by their own mechanics. Flers falls. The British advance a couple of miles, but the front does not collapse. Overhead, meanwhile, the Royal Flying Corps and the German Air Service confront one another with hundreds of aircraft. Reconnaissance planes correcting artillery fire, fighters dueling a few dozen feet above the ground. Here, too, the Allies gain local superiority, but nothing decisive. Tanks and airplanes show the future of war, but on the Somme in 1916, the present is still made above all of artillery, trenches, and mutual attrition. October brings rain and cold. The ground on the Somme, already pitted with craters, turns into a swamp. Tanks bog down, horses sink, and infantry slog forward in mud up to their knees. In spite of everything, the attacks continue. In mid-November, between the 13th and the 18th, the British attempt one last big push, the Battle of Ancre. Fifth Army finally takes villages such as Beaumont-Hamel, helped by the 51st Highland Division, and pushes forward a few miles. They pay with tens of thousands of casualties in a few weeks. The Germans, defending and then abandoning those positions, suffer a comparable number. By the end of November, after about 140 days of fighting, the Allied front has advanced only about 6 miles. No German collapse, no decisive victory, only 2 exhausted armies planted in the mud. Together with Verdun, the Somme pushed the war onto a scale of losses no earlier generation had seen. In about 4.5 months, the British lost around 420,000 men, of whom more than 120,000 were killed. The French lost about 200,000. German casualties ran between 450,000 and 500,000, a figure similar to, if not greater than, that of the Allies. In all, roughly 1 million soldiers were put out of action to move the front line about 6 miles. For Britain, the Somme was a national shock. The PALS battalions were cut down. Whole neighborhoods and towns lost in a few days. A generation of men. Yet it was also the baptism of fire for the new armies. From a small colonial force, the British Army became a mass army, able to sustain a long war of attrition. For Germany, the Somme was even more significant. One officer would call it the grave of our army. Entire divisions were consumed. Experienced NCOs and officers fell by the thousand, and reserves no longer sufficed. From then on, Berlin knew it could not win an endless war of attrition. Behind the lines, millions of shells were turned out in factories, often by women who had entered war industry in great numbers. Verdun and the Somme together were the most brutal demonstration of what trench warfare on the Western Front meant.
The guns fell silent on November 11, 1918. It was a Monday, and the battle for the future had just begun. World War I didn't just end empires. It redrew borders, redefined nations, and planted the seeds for the conflicts that shaped the 20th century. How did one war change the entire world? By the end of 1918, the world was at a crossroads. 4 years of relentless war had left nations shattered and societies drained of resources and hope. Entire cities lay in ruins. Economies were on the brink of collapse, and millions of lives had been lost. The great empires that once dominated the globe, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, were in freefall, torn apart by revolution, defeat, and internal division. For centuries, these empires had defined the political and geographic order of the world. But as the fighting ended, their collapse left a power vacuum, setting the stage for one of history's most dramatic reshaping of borders. In the wake of war, a new world was born. But at what cost? And how did the choices made in 1919 set the course for future conflicts? As the First World War drew to a close in late 1918, the Central Powers were in disarray, grappling with internal collapse and external defeats. Germany faced revolution as its people, exhausted by war, demanded change. The abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II on November 9, 1918, marked the fall of the Second Reich, paving the way for the formation of the Weimar Republic. Democratic forces pushed for peace, hoping to stabilize the nation amidst chaos. For many Germans, the war's end felt like a betrayal. Although their armies had not been decisively defeated on the battlefield, the signing of the armistice created the perception of a politically imposed surrender. This narrative fueled the "stab in the back" myth, which wrongfully blamed Germany's defeat on internal enemies like socialists and Jews, rather than military shortcomings. This myth would profoundly shape post-war German politics, sowing the seeds of future extremism. Elsewhere among the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary crumbled under the weight of ethnic tensions and internal divisions, splintering into multiple new nations. The Ottoman Empire, already weakened by uprisings and military defeats, faced further fragmentation. Across the Central Powers, economic devastation compounded political instability, leaving populations hungry and desperate. On November 11, 1918, the Armistice of Compiègne brought an end to the fighting in World War I. The armistice imposed strict terms on Germany, including immediate demilitarization, the surrender of heavy weapons, and the withdrawal of troops from occupied territories. Allied forces also took control of strategic areas like the Rhineland, ensuring Germany could not launch further offensives. The armistice set the stage for the Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919. The treaty's terms were harsh. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war under the War Guilt Clause, pay massive reparations, and endure severe territorial losses, including Alsace-Lorraine to France and portions of land to Poland and Belgium. The Rhineland was permanently demilitarized to act as a buffer with France, and Germany's army was restricted to 100,000 troops with no tanks or aircraft. As the treaty was debated in the United States, Woodrow Wilson issued a stark warning, quote, "If we do not end the present quarrel by a settlement, it will only be a preparation for another quarrel." Wilson's vision for peace, outlined in his 14 points, emphasized self-determination for nations and the establishment of a League of Nations to prevent further conflicts. Despite Wilson's leadership in crafting the treaty, the US Senate refused to ratify it, largely due to fears that the League of Nations would entangle the US in foreign wars. The United States signed separate peace treaties in 1921, remaining outside the League, which weakened its authority and effectiveness. The Treaty of Versailles aimed to ensure lasting peace, but its punitive terms instead created resentment and instability, particularly in Germany, setting the stage for future conflict. Wilson's fears of unresolved tensions would prove tragically prescient. The aftermath of World War I saw the disintegration of old empires and the redrawing of global boundaries, fundamentally altering the geopolitical landscape. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once a sprawling multi-ethnic state, splintered into several new nations. Austria and Hungary became independent countries, while Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia emerged as states designed to unite ethnic groups. However, these borders often ignored cultural complexities, creating internal tensions. The October Revolution of 1917 and the ensuing Civil War tore the Russian Empire apart, leading to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. Russia ceded Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, which became independent states. While these losses and internal chaos weakened the emerging Soviet Union, it remained determined to reclaim influence in the future. Italy's post-war gains, including South Tyrol and Istria, fell short of promises made in the Treaty of London, 1915. The failure to secure Dalmatian territories fueled nationalist resentment, which would later contribute to the rise of fascism under Benito Mussolini. After World War I, Cameroon and Togoland were divided between Britain and France under the League of Nations mandates, with Britain taking smaller portions of each. Namibia was assigned to South Africa, part of the British Empire, under a similar mandate. Meanwhile, France expanded its influence in West Africa, taking the majority of Cameroon and Togoland previously under German rule. In the Pacific, Japan extended its influence by taking over former German territories, including islands in the South Pacific. These acquisitions not only bolstered British and French colonial power, but also fueled resentment in Germany, laying groundwork for future tensions. Japan emerged from World War I as a rising force in the Pacific, skillfully using the conflict to expand its territorial reach. By seizing former German territories, including the Marshall, Caroline, and the Mariana Islands, Japan solidified its dominance in the region. This calculated expansion wasn't just opportunistic, it marked the dawn of Japan's ascent as a major regional power, setting the stage for its growing ambitions in the decades to come. The US emerged from the war as an economic and military powerhouse. Though it returned to isolationism, the global influence of American industry and finance grew, setting the stage for its future role as a world leader. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire marked a dramatic turning point in the Middle East, as its vast territories were partitioned among the Allied powers. Through mandates sanctioned by the League of Nations, Britain and France imposed their control, redrawing the region's borders to suit their colonial ambitions. The roots of this division lay in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret deal between Britain and France that divided Ottoman lands into spheres of influence. Britain took control of Palestine, including the area that would later become a point of contention as Israel, as well as the oil-rich lands of Iraq. France, meanwhile, gained control over Syria and Lebanon, territories strategically important for their proximity to European colonial holdings. Amid this reshaping, one region resisted partition. Led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, Turkey successfully fought off occupying forces, rejecting Allied plans to carve up Anatolia. By 1923, Atatürk had established the Republic of Turkey, a modern secular state built on sweeping reforms that transformed Turkish society and governance. At the same time, British policy in Palestine further complicated the region's future. In the Balfour Declaration of 1917, Britain promised to support the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, a move that intensified tensions with the Arab population already living there. This commitment, combined with British control, sowed the seeds of enduring conflict in the region, a legacy of division and unrest that continues to shape the Middle East to this day. The Ottoman Empire's partition created many of the Middle East's modern problems. New borders split communities that once coexisted and forced rivals together, sparking long-lasting conflicts like the Israeli-Palestinian dispute and struggles in Iraq and Syria. These divisions continue to shape the region's politics, linking its history to ongoing tensions and aspirations for the future. The aftermath of World War I reverberated far beyond the battlefields of Europe, reshaping global politics and fueling tensions that would shape the modern era. The Treaty of Versailles and the new borders it imposed triggered outrage, discontent, and lasting instability. Across Europe, newly formed states like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia grappled with ethnic divisions and fragile political structures, creating internal instability that would linger for decades. In the Middle East, the arbitrary borders imposed by Allied powers disregarded the region's complex demographics, fostering sectarian tensions that continue to shape conflicts in Palestine, Iraq, and Syria. In China, the decision to award Shandong province to Japan rather than returning it to Chinese control sparked a wave of nationalist protests. The May 4th movement in 1919 became a defining moment in the country's push for sovereignty and modern reform. Meanwhile, in Germany, harsh treaty terms and economic struggles deepened resentment, fueling demands for revision and laying the groundwork for political extremism. The promises of autonomy made to colonies during the war were largely unfulfilled, sparking widespread dissatisfaction and fueling nationalist movements in Africa, India, and the Middle East. The global shift in power dynamics also bred resentment in countries like Italy and Germany, where dissatisfaction with territorial outcomes contributed to the rise of fascist ideologies and leaders like Mussolini and Hitler. Finally, the displacement of millions, including ethnic Germans, Armenians, and others, created humanitarian crises and reshaped populations across Europe and the Middle East, further compounding the turmoil of a world struggling to recover from war. The decisions made in 1919 didn't just end a war, they shaped the next century. Subscribe, like, and hit the bell to stay in the loop and join us on this journey through history.